very well versed. Don't kid yourself. He knew all. He'd say Shakespeare. I don't read Shakespeare. He read all of Shakespeare when he was a kid. But one of the great stories he told me. He said, you know, I was down in El Paso, sleeping on a park bench, and in the morning the cop came and he made me get up, and I saw a little red brick library. And I walked in that library and I saw a book on the shelf, Notes from the Underground, by a man named Bukowski. Well, I'm pronouncing it wrong. Big D. And I sat down, I picked up that book, and I started reading those words, and they marched into me like lightning. So that was one of the great influences of him. You mentioned Gorky, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, all those guys, all those big Russians. Just like he loved, you know, I'd go to the place and he played strictly classical music. And if it had a voice in it, he wasn't interested. He just wanted the music. But he loved Shostakovich, Rachmaninoff, and he loved saying their names, Sergei Rachmaninoff. Just like Hemingway, just the name Hemingway was a talisman. Because we'd be sitting there in silence, and suddenly he'd say, Hemingway. Well, you know, there's only one answer to that. I had to say, Thomas Wolfe.
How did that go over?
Well, William Faulkner, man.
So you saw him and raised him?
We'd go all evening long we had a little cassette tape recorder, and Linda, I know you have some of those cassettes, and I have them. We would fight for time on the tape machine. You know, we really would, you know, we'd insult each other, we would say, oh, you know what you are? He said, you're a great circular glob of nothing. It's so good that I don't mind saying it, it's great.
Is it because of him that you became a poet?
No, I was already writing poetry, but probably he's been a great guy to play off against for 50 years. It's been great.
And because of your acquaintanceship with him, do you feel that it's like being in orbit around the sun. You're so drawn to the sun. Did you have to work not to be like him when you wrote, or did you want to be like him? Was that the attraction?
Hey, this is great. It's like being on a psychiatrist now.
Where did you get my bill?
Well, I'll just send it to the Huntington. Well, you know, it's true in a way. You know, I was just in Italy, and I did some readings, and, you know, people come up to you and say, tell me about Bukowski, you know, tell me about Charles Bukowski. I'm down in Oaxaca, Mexico, and this kid comes up to me and he says, was he a nice man? Oh, I said, yes, he was a gentleman. You know, speaking of psychology and psychiatry, my partner happens to be a psychiatrist. We were at Bukowski's house the night he first met Jesse, and he said, and Linda was there, and for weeks he was afraid of meeting Jesse, you know. Look, I'm not crazy, man, I'll handle this guy. He didn't know that my partner was very easygoing, you know, laid-back kind of guy, so Jesse comes in the room and Bukowski meets him. Jesse, my man, you know. And he said, why don't you analyze Neeli? And Jesse said, why don't you analyze Neeli? So Bukowski gave one of the greatest self-analysis I ever heard. In other words, he analyzed himself.
Give us some insights.
Well, you know, he was very sure of his. One thing about him, he was very sure of his relationship to Los Angeles. I just drove across the basin from LAX to get here, and I realized why I live in San Francisco. I love Los Angeles. No, wait. I love Los Angeles. I love so much about Los Angeles, but I don't like driving in traffic. But I drove up Normandy, and I went by where Ned's Liquor was, and I went by the Pioneer Chicken Place. We probably went 200 or 300 times. And then I went by where Norm's used to be on Sunset. We'd go there like 4 in the morning for the steak and egg special. And he had this great, incredible relationship with Los Angeles, wouldn't you say? When I was here 4 years ago, the poem I read, Crucifix at a Death Hand, it begins, His understanding of LA began this way. Yes, they begin out in the willows. The starch mountains begin in the willows and keep on going without regard for pumas or nectarine. Somehow these mountains are like an old woman with a bad memory and a shopping basket. We are in the basin, that is the idea, down in the dust and the alley. This land punched in, puffed out, divided, and subdivided the Spaniards all the way back in Spain.
You knew him for most of your adult life. So how did your relationship change toward the end?
Well, we were in and out of, we had our arguments and fights, and over years we didn't see one another, and then after, we hadn't seen each other for years, and after the Barfly movie, I got in touch with him, came up to the house, and I was with my partner, and I was a little nervous because I was with this guy, and Linda's there, and Bukowski says to me, listen, I'm so glad you're with somebody, I hope you guys are staying the night. So that was like a blessing from like a father. It was very sweet, very cool.
Anything else you have to add?
No, but I do want to read, I brought a poem to read, but I'd like to read it from the podium in honor of Hank.